Amidst the bright lights of the city, old lady Clara Simmons walked into a high-class restaurant, carrying a simple yet majestic appearance. She just wanted to enjoy a peaceful meal, but no one in the restaurant expected that this seemingly ordinary customer would be the beginning of a surprising story about kindness, equality, and the true value of human beings. If you find this story interesting, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more interesting stories. Clara Brown is an elderly black woman who lives alone in a small but cozy house on the outskirts of the city. Although she is nearly 80 years old, Clara still maintains a sharp mind and intelligence that not everyone has when they reach old age. She never allows herself to become weak or dependent on anyone. Her hair is white, her skin is wrinkled due to the years, but Clara's eyes are still bright, full of optimism and resilience. Every morning, she gets up early to walk around the neighborhood, holding a cane in her hand, her eyes always looking forward, as if she is preparing to enter a new day full of challenges. Clara lived a simple life, but everyone in her neighborhood knew she was no ordinary person. She was a part of history, not only because of her age but also because of her quiet contributions to the community. Clara was a mother, grandmother, aunt, and friend to those in need. Although she did not hold any prominent positions in society, Clara always had a way to make an impact. She was one of the founders and maintainers of charitable organizations that helped the black community, especially the elderly and disadvantaged. Clara was an example of perseverance, kindness, and mutual respect. That morning, like every other day, Clara felt a little different. Today was the day she wanted to take some time for herself, away from the hustle and bustle of charity work and the endless phone calls. She decided to go to a fancy restaurant that she had heard a lot about recently. It was a restaurant with an expensive menu, a formal space and sophisticated service. Clara did not often go to such places, but today she wanted to try it once, as a way to enjoy herself. In fact, she had received a special invitation from this restaurant, inviting her to enjoy a free dinner on a special occasion. Clara thought this would be a good opportunity to experience the life of the upper class. As Clara entered the restaurant, a luxurious space opened up before her eyes. The soft light from the chandeliers glittered on the ceiling, creating an elegant and peaceful atmosphere. Smooth wooden tables, covered with pure white tablecloths, were surrounded by well-dressed people enjoying expensive dishes. The waiters in formal uniforms, each with a polite demeanor, moved quietly between tables, highlighting the sophistication of the place. The atmosphere here was so different from the restaurants she usually visited, where there was noise and familiar locals. Clara felt a little strange, but she did not show any hesitation. She stood up straight, walked confidently, and approached the reception desk to make her reservation. Despite the solemn silence that surrounded her, Clara did not feel out of place. She felt that even though she was an old woman, and might not wear expensive clothes like the people around her, the confidence and respect she carried with her could not be hidden. After all, she was just a human being with needs and rights like everyone else. The receptionist, a young woman named Jenna, looked at Clara as she walked in. She couldn't help but notice her dark skin and somewhat plain clothes. Even though she was a professional, Jenna couldn't hide the annoyance on her face when she saw Clara. Jenna smiled coldly and asked, "Hello, where would you like to eat?" Clara simply replied, "I have a reservation, my name is Clara Brown." Jenna checked the list and after a moment, she shook her head, saying that Clara Brown was not in their system. There must be a mistake. Jenna said coolly, "We don't have any tables available at the moment, you can try another day." Clara sensed something was wrong. She had called ahead and confirmed her reservation. She knew she had done nothing wrong, and she did not want to be treated this way just because of her appearance and age. Clara did not want to make a big deal out of it, but she also understood that sometimes, people like her needed to speak up to be respected. She said softly, "I want to see the manager of the restaurant, and clarify the situation." Clara stood still, her gaze calm but determined. Despite the cold and distant atmosphere in the upscale restaurant, she was undaunted. In fact, she had been through some tough times in her life, from fighting for the rights of the black community to facing discrimination in society. But today, although she didn't want to make a big deal out of it, she knew it was time to speak up. Jenna looked at Clara suspiciously, but didn't answer right away. She turned to another coworker to ask about the situation, as if the old woman standing before her didn't deserve to be treated like a normal customer. Jenna's gaze was filled with annoyance, as if Clara was intruding on this luxurious space. The younger employee frowned, seemingly skeptical of the ability of an elderly, black woman to come to a place like this to enjoy a luxurious meal. When Jenna returned, she remained cool and said softly, "I'm sorry, but we don't have any seats available for you today. You can come back another day when we have more space." Clara didn't seem flustered or upset. She patiently repeated, "I made a reservation. I called to confirm, and I know for sure that I have a table. I just want to speak to the manager of the restaurant to clarify." At this, Jenna frowned and sneered, as if Clara's request was not worthy of attention. "I said there is no room, and our restaurant cannot serve an old lady like you at this time," she said, not hesitating to let the discrimination show in her tone. Clara felt the discrimination in Jenna's words. She could see clearly that her skin color and age had made the employee feel no sympathy. This was not the first time she had faced racism, but this time it made her feel disappointed and hurt. In order to not let the situation go further, she kept her cool. Clara did not let her anger or frustration affect her. "You don't understand, but I'm the one who made this place a success," Clara said, her voice soft but confident. "If you don't believe me, you can check with the restaurant manager." Jenna was silent for a moment, but then shook her head, giving no sign of changing her mind. She simply replied, "I'll call the manager to see if he can help you." Clara felt a little uncomfortable at this point, but she knew that she had to be patient. After all, no one could refuse a reasonable request from a customer, especially when they had made a reservation. She just wanted to have a peaceful meal, and had no intention of causing trouble for anyone. Jenna walked into the restaurant, and Clara stood alone at the front desk, while the surrounding customers continued to stare at her, sometimes curiously, sometimes judgingly from people who seemed unfamiliar to her. Clara didn't mind the looks. She had lived long enough to know that people could make assumptions about her based on things that weren't true, but she didn't need to prove anything. Clara just hoped that this restaurant wouldn't let racism continue to influence how they treated her. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man walked out from inside. He was wearing a black suit, looking polite but a little hurried. This was the person Clara had been waiting for. He was Thomas, the restaurant manager she wanted to meet. "Hello, Clara, is that right?" Mr. Thomas said, his eyes showing surprise but also very polite. Clara nodded, responding with a small smile. "Yes, I'm Clara Brown," she said. "I had a reservation and I don't understand why I was refused service." Thomas looked at Jenna, and then back at Clara, looking confused. Jenna just stood there silently, not saying anything more. Feeling the tension in the air, Thomas quickly spoke up, "I'm sorry, ma'am, I really don't know about this. I'll clarify this right away. Please follow me." As Clara followed Thomas inside, she couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. She didn't want to cause trouble or complicate the situation, but she understood that sometimes, not everything you wish for can happen easily. Clara said nothing more, just silently followed the manager, while a gentle sadness rose in her heart. The feeling she had faced so many times in her life, rejection because of the color of her skin, was once again resurfacing. But Clara did not let it control her. She was used to challenges. And she believed that today, the truth would be revealed. Clara followed Thomas through the restaurant's elegant rows of tables, her heart pounding. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but she knew that what was happening was more than a simple misunderstanding. She could sense the discrimination in Jenna's attitude, and although she had lived long enough to deal with such attitudes, today she couldn't let this go unaddressed. Thomas led her to a small table in a secluded corner of the restaurant where few people passed by. When they sat down, Clara could feel the tension in the air. Thomas placed his hands on the table, looked at her silently, and said, "Mrs. Clara, I'm sorry about what happened. I really didn't know what happened, and I apologize for the inconvenience." Clara sat up straight, her eyes never leaving the manager. "This is not a simple incident," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "This is not just about not having a table. I feel like I was turned away simply because I am a black woman, and possibly because of my age." Thomas was silent for a moment, as if he was thinking carefully about what she said. He clearly hadn't expected the situation to be so serious. Clara continued, not giving him a chance to change the subject. "I made a reservation, and I'm sure I have no reason to be treated like this. I even received an invitation to this restaurant. It was Ms. Jenna who turned me down, and I feel very disappointed." Mr. Thomas nodded, his eyes flashing with annoyance. He seemed to sense that something was wrong with the way his employee had acted. "I apologize, I will clarify right away. But Ms. Clara, I think there is some misunderstanding. I will meet with Jenna again and ask her to explain clearly." Thomas stood up, turning to leave, but Clara wouldn't let him go right away. She held up a hand, stopping him. "Wait. I don't want to just accept an apology. I want to know why I was treated this way, and who's responsible. Again, I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but I need to know why." Clara looked him straight in the eye, not softening in the least. Thomas paused, looking at her for a long moment. Suddenly he opened up, as if he understood something more important than he had thought. "Ms. Clara, I didn't know about this before. Jenna is very new here, and she may not be familiar with all the customers. But I will investigate and handle this situation myself." Thomas took his phone out of his pocket and dialed someone. Clara sat silently, feeling the storm she had just experienced. She was frustrated not only by Jenna's attitude but also by the nature of the society she had lived in, where segregation still existed insidiously, even after all these years. Clara did not feel angry, but she felt the weariness that anyone in the black community felt when faced with situations like this. A few minutes later, Thomas hung up and came back, his expression a little more serious. "Clara, I've contacted Jenna and she'll be retrained immediately. I really didn't expect her to have this attitude." "Is this the first time you've encountered this situation?" Thomas asked. Clara nodded, saying nothing. She didn't want to worry too much about meaningless explanations. She just needed to know that this manager truly understood that racism was not something that could happen in a fancy restaurant, especially when the customer had done nothing wrong. What she wanted was respect, not just an apology. After a moment of silence, Thomas hesitated for a moment, then continued, "Mrs. Clara, I don't know if you know, but I really admire you. This restaurant is largely funded by some special investors, and one of them is your nephew. He mentioned you many times when we discussed decisions in operating the restaurant." Clara looked at Thomas in surprise. "My nephew?" she asked, trying to keep her composure. Clara had no memory of any of her nephews going into the restaurant business, but the mention of his name made her think. "Who is he?" Thomas looked at Clara, his expression uncertain. "His name is James Brown," he said. "You probably know him. James is a big investor in this restaurant. He is very important to our future." Clara was shocked by this statement. She couldn't believe her ears. James, one of her nephews whom she hadn't seen in years, was involved in this restaurant. It turned out that her nephew was one of the people who had a big influence on the management of the place where she had just been denied service. She felt a little dizzy, but then things gradually began to clear up in her mind. Thomas continued, "We are very sorry for what happened, and I hope you will give us a chance to make it up to you. The restaurant values customers like you, and we will do our best to satisfy you next time." Clara nodded slightly, though her heart was filled with emotion. She never wanted to be in this situation, but perhaps this was an opportunity for things to change. Her thoughts were not only about serving in the restaurant, but also about how she could make the younger generation understand what she had gone through. "Thank you, Thomas. I'll wait and see how this restaurant handles it," Clara said, softly but confidently. After a tense conversation with Thomas, Clara was invited to sit at her own table in a quieter area where she could enjoy her meal without feeling discriminated against. However, her mind was still filled with chaotic thoughts about the incident and Thomas's revelation about his nephew, James Brown. She could not deny her surprise, but she could not quite understand why James was involved in this restaurant, especially since she had not seen him for so long. Clara had spent most of her life fighting for the rights of her community, especially black people, and she had not always paid attention to events involving her family. But today, it made her think. This new information opened a door she had never considered before. Clara had not thought that her family, or more specifically her nephew, would have any influence over the place where she had just been denied service. But was this a coincidence, or part of a larger plan she had never known about? She looked around, her eyes lingering on the exquisite dishes on the table. In fact, Clara was not interested in this luxury. She had lived through difficult times, had fought for equality all her life. To her, such luxurious meals meant nothing if they were accompanied by discrimination and indifference. But today, it seemed she was faced with a different situation, one where she was not the only one being judged and discriminated against. After she was served her meal, Clara sat alone in the quiet. Even though she had been served and apologized, she still felt that something was wrong. She couldn't stop thinking about James, whom she hadn't seen in years. The image of the innocent boy she had cared for had gradually faded from her memory. James, the person she had placed so much hope and love in, was now part of a world she didn't understand. Clara felt that there was something she didn't know, a secret she needed to uncover. When the meal was over, Clara left the restaurant in a conflicted mood. She couldn't forget Jenna's suspicious gaze, and she couldn't forget Thomas's words about James. She needed to find out if James was really an important part of this restaurant, and if so, why hadn't he told her? A few days later, Clara decided to contact James. Although she knew that the distance between them had been built up over the years, she felt that it was necessary. Clara did not want to let secrets linger in her heart. She called the office where James worked, but when the secretary answered, she realized that meeting him would not be easy. "Hello, Clara, I'm sorry, but James is currently on a long business trip. He's out of the country for an important conference. But I can leave my information and he'll call you back as soon as he can," the secretary replied, her voice polite but somewhat cold. Clara nodded, but she couldn't help but feel uneasy. This only made her more suspicious. If James was so important to the restaurant, why didn't he inform her about his involvement in all these business activities? Why was she being refused service when she had such a close connection to the restaurant through her nephew? This suspicion made Clara even more determined to find out more clearly. She decided to meet some people related to James in the work, hoping that this information would shed more light on his involvement in the restaurant and the relationships that might exist in this complicated world. A few days later, Clara managed to contact one of James's former partners, whom she knew had worked with him on investment projects. She was a woman named Linda, whom Clara had met several times at community meetings. Linda had always been enthusiastic about her work and had a close relationship with James. Clara called Linda and invited her to a small cafe in the downtown area, where they could talk comfortably without being disturbed. When Linda showed up, Clara could see that she seemed busy and stressed, but Linda still greeted her cheerfully. "Hello, Clara, it's nice to see you again," Linda said, her eyes warm but a little worried. "What's up?" Clara looked Linda straight in the eye, not wanting to drag the conversation out. "I want to ask about James," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I know he was involved in that restaurant. But I haven't been informed of any involvement. Is that true?" Linda sat down, pondered for a moment before speaking, but her expression had completely changed. "Mrs. Clara, perhaps it's time for you to know the truth. James, he's not just a small investor like you think. He's the main operator of that restaurant, and all important decisions regarding the restaurant's operations must have his approval. Linda's answer shocked Clara. James runs the restaurant, she repeated, unable to believe her ears. Linda nodded. That's right. James has taken the lead, and his big investment has changed the entire direction of the restaurant. He kept it a secret for personal reasons, and didn't want you to know so as not to worry you. But maybe it's time you knew the truth. Clara felt things beginning to make sense. The scattered pieces of events were slowly coming together into a clearer picture. She didn't know how to feel about it, but she was certain that this encounter had completely changed the way she viewed James. Since her conversation with Linda, Clara has felt a wave of strong emotions rising within her. Everything she once believed in has become unclear and complicated. Clara cannot ignore the truth about James' role in the restaurant, but what bothers her most is the discrimination she has experienced from Jenna. She cannot sit idly by while this remains unresolved. After receiving information from Linda, Clara decided not to let things go on without a clear explanation. She called Thomas and asked to meet Jenna in person. Clara knew that this meeting would not be easy, but she believed that she had to face the truth and could not let an employee like Jenna run amok without being held accountable. A few days later, Thomas arranged a meeting between Clara and Jenna at the restaurant, where it all began. When Clara entered the restaurant, she no longer felt the excitement or glamour of the previous meal. A heavy, resentful feeling filled her heart. The lighting in the restaurant today seemed less warm than before, and Clara felt like an unwelcome guest. When Jenna entered the room, Clara immediately noticed her cold and arrogant demeanor. Jenna kept her professional demeanor, but Clara could sense the disrespect in the way she looked at her. Without hesitation, Clara walked straight up to Jenna and began to speak. "Jenna, I want to be clear with you about my behavior that day. I am not one to forgive unfair treatment," Clara said, her voice cold and firm. "You rejected me simply because I am a black woman. You made me feel like I didn't belong here." Jenna looked at Clara, her eyes somewhat surprised, but she did not react immediately. She took a deep breath, then replied, "I don't know what you're talking about, Clara. I was just following the restaurant's rules, and I didn't know who you were when you came in. If you feel discriminated against, I'm truly sorry, but that's not what I meant." Clara pursed her lips, sensing the arrogance in Jenna's words. She knew that Jenna's apologies were insincere. She was trying to minimize the problem and avoid responsibility. Clara couldn't let it end like this. "Do you know who I am?" Clara asked, her voice firm. "You know that I am James Brown's grandmother, right? He has the final say in the future of this restaurant. And I will not let anyone, not you or anyone else, treat me like this." When Clara mentioned James' name, Jenna's eyes changed slightly. She was confused, seemingly beginning to realize that this situation was not a simple misunderstanding. However, Jenna still maintained her complacent attitude, replying in a cold tone, "I really don't know who you are. But I don't think that being James' grandmother justifies the way you want to treat me." Clara felt her heart constrict. Not only was she not admitting her mistake, she was also being disrespectful, acting as if the whole thing was nothing serious. She knew she couldn't let it go any longer. "You may not know who I am, but that doesn't give you a reason to treat me like a guest who doesn't deserve respect. Everyone here has the right to be treated fairly and with respect, no matter who they are. And if you can't do that, then maybe you don't deserve to be here." Jenna frowned and replied firmly, "So what do you want me to do? I was just doing my job. Do you want me to sincerely apologize?" Clara felt her body shake with anger, but she kept her composure. She didn't want to lose control. "I don't need your apology anymore," she said, her voice firm but not aggressive. "What I want is for you to understand that your actions may have hurt someone else. Not all customers are who you think they are. We deserve to be treated equally, without discrimination." Jenna was silent for a long time, but you could see that she couldn't hide the discomfort in her eyes. However, she finally said, "I will learn and try to improve myself. I'm sorry if you feel hurt. But I'm just an employee. If you have any problems, you should talk to the manager. Clara looked at Jenna for a long moment, then nodded. That's what I needed to hear, she said, not softening. Clara knew she hadn't quite grasped the importance of changing her attitude, but at least she'd said what Clara needed to hear. A few minutes later, Thomas entered the room, sensing the tension in the air. Clara didn't want to prolong the conversation any further, so she stood up and prepared to leave. Before she walked out the door, she turned back to look at Jenna one more time. I hope you change your mind, Clara said, and walked out, feeling like she had accomplished something important, if not easy. Clara has no regrets about confronting Jenna. She knows that discrimination cannot be allowed to exist in a society where everyone should be equal. And she also knows that she, with her own strength and experience, must be the one to take the lead in this fight. Clara walked out of the room with mixed feelings of tension, not knowing if she and Jenna had really understood the message she was trying to convey. Either way, she felt she had done the right thing by not letting Jenna's attitude as an employee diminish her worth. But soon, an unexpected encounter took place, one that would complicate things and reveal secrets Clara could not have anticipated. A few days after her tense confrontation with Jenna, Clara received a call from Thomas. His voice was worried, but he remained polite. Hello, Clara, I'd like to invite you to a restaurant this weekend. There are a few things I think you should know. Clara felt a little confused, but at the same time she had a hunch that this was her chance to learn more about what was going on. She accepted Thomas's invitation and decided to come at the appointed time. When Clara arrived at the restaurant, the atmosphere was still the same, elegant and polite. However, the uneasy feeling in her heart did not seem to disappear, especially when she knew that she was about to face an unclear truth. Thomas met her at the entrance and led her into a private room, where there was no one but him and another man, who seemed to be the restaurant's senior manager. Hello, Clara, thank you for coming, Thomas began. This is Richard, the manager of the restaurant. He will explain what we have discovered recently. Clara greeted Mr. Richard and sat down. His expression was a little serious, but not like someone who intended to be confrontational. Ms. Clara, I apologize for putting you through that unpleasant situation earlier, Mr. Richard began. We conducted an internal investigation after you left. And we found out some things that couldn't be ignored. Clara sat silently, feeling a wave of anxiety rise up inside her. It seemed that things were not as simple as she had imagined. What happened, Mr. Richard? Clara asked, her voice firm but patient. We reviewed the records and found some irregularities in the restaurant's management system, especially the decisions regarding the selection of customers. However, the important thing we discovered was about James. Mr. Richard paused for a moment, then continued, we couldn't help but see the connection between you and James, and after verifying, we discovered that James had made major changes to the restaurant's investment structure. This means, our restaurant now really belongs to him, and Ms. Clara, you are part of this change. Clara was surprised. Richard's words made her feel like the ground was falling away from her. She had never imagined that James had such a profound influence on this restaurant. James really runs this restaurant? She asked, her voice somewhat confused, hardly believing what she had just heard. Yes, Clara, Richard replied. James is not just an investor, but has control over the major decisions of the restaurant. In fact, he has changed the entire strategy of the restaurant and invested a huge amount of capital here. Clara was shocked. Everything seemed to be changing so fast that she couldn't keep up. Then why didn't he tell me about this? Why should I have to endure discrimination from an employee I thought was irresponsible? Clara asked, her voice filled with anger. That's what we're trying to figure out, Thomas said, looking apologetic. We didn't know about your relationship with James. It was only recently discovered, and when you came to the restaurant, we didn't realize you were James's grandmother. In fact, we didn't know you had such power over the restaurant. Clara couldn't help but feel angry and disappointed. So just because I'm a black woman, they didn't recognize who I am, and judged me based on my appearance?" Clara said, unable to hide her indignation. "Does this restaurant only care about people with money and power? Not everyone can be like James." Mr. Richard bowed his head, seemingly sensing the pain in Clara's words. "We apologize for this oversight. But we will make it right. We will do everything we can to ensure that all customers are treated fairly, without discrimination." Clara looked at him, somewhat relieved, but not quite satisfied. "Those are nice words, but I want action. I don't want anyone to suffer this discrimination again, James or anyone else," she said, her eyes determined. Thomas nodded. "We will do everything to restore the restaurant's reputation and do exactly what you asked." Clara stood up, feeling like she had won a great battle, even though the battle was still long. "I hope you are serious. And I will be closely monitoring every move of this restaurant from now on." The heavy feeling in Clara's heart was somewhat relieved as she left the meeting room, but she also knew that things would never be that simple. This battle had only just begun, and Clara would continue to fight for her rights and the rights of those around her. After meeting with Thomas and Mr. Richard, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. She couldn't ignore what had happened, but at least she had spoken up and demanded change. She knew that this was the first step toward changing the restaurant's attitude. However, Clara also knew that real change wasn't easy, and she had to follow up to make sure the promises were kept. In the days that followed, Clara noticed a marked difference in the restaurant's attitude toward her. At first, she only felt a sense of reserve in the staff's attitude, but the change gradually became more obvious. When she went to eat at the restaurant one weekend, Clara noticed that the staff no longer acted as annoyed or looked down on her as before. Instead, they treated her with respect, and things seemed to gradually improve. The attitude of Jenna, the waitress who had turned her down, had also changed. Clara noticed that she was working harder and acting more professionally. Jenna no longer looked at her with cold eyes. Instead, she greeted Clara with a gentle and attentive smile. Clara knew that this change was not accidental. Surely after her confrontation with Jenna, she had to face the consequences and change her attitude. A week after that meeting, Clara received a call from Thomas, who became a constant companion throughout the process. "Clara, I wanted to let you know that we've made some changes to the way we treat customers in the restaurant. Starting next week, we'll be conducting training sessions for all employees on respect and treating customers equally, regardless of where they come from or how they come from," Thomas said on the phone. "You've made us realize that we have a lot of room for improvement." Clara felt relieved to hear those words, but she knew it was only the beginning. "I'm glad you guys realize that. But I want to see concrete actions. Not just words. I want to see you actually change the way you think about customers like me." Thomas pledged to take concrete steps to ensure fairness and non-discrimination in all aspects of the restaurant. "We're going to start by creating a new employee code of conduct, a strict policy on how to treat all customers. You'll see that change starting now." Hearing these words, Clara couldn't help but feel relieved. However, she still decided not to let her guard down and continued to monitor, because she knew that sometimes, real change takes time to prove. A week later, Clara returned to the restaurant, but this time she wasn't just there to eat. She decided to check out the changes Thomas had promised. When she walked in, she noticed a difference in the atmosphere. The staff, from the manager to the servers, were professional and respectful to all customers. Clara could feel that the change was real. She was greeted warmly, without discrimination, and this made her feel very happy. However, what surprised Clara was Jenna's attitude. Not only did the waitress work hard, she also smiled, asked kindly, and helped her constantly. Clara knew that the change in Jenna's attitude was not just an improvement in her work style, but also a realization of human value and fairness. It seemed that Jenna understood the importance of respect and treating everyone equally. A sense of pride washed over Clara as she realized that what she was fighting for had an impact not only on herself, but also on the small community of people who worked at this restaurant. Clara felt that she had not only won her fight against Jenna, but had also created a big push for change in the way people viewed and treated each other in this society. That day, Clara sat peacefully enjoying her meal, but inside she felt relieved. She knew that this change was just beginning, but at least, there were clear signs. Respect and equality were not so far away. And she, with her experiences and strength, had proven that change could start with one person. But Clara also knows that the fight is not over. Even though some changes have been made at the restaurant, she will continue to monitor them closely, because she knows that every action, every change, must be sustained and cannot be just empty promises. One cool afternoon, a few weeks after Clara had seen the positive changes at the restaurant, she received an unexpected call from Thomas. He invited her to a special celebration at the restaurant that weekend. "We have a surprise for you," Thomas said, his voice full of excitement. Clara, curious but calm, agreed to attend. When Clara entered the restaurant that day, she felt a different atmosphere. The staff were dressed in formal attire, the lights were bright, and everything seemed to be set up perfectly. Thomas appeared, smiling and greeting her with respect. "Hello, Clara, I'm glad you're here. Please follow me," he said, leading her down a long hallway decorated with vintage black and white photographs. What surprised Clara was that when she entered a large room at the end of the hallway, all the restaurant staff, including manager Richard and Jenna, were already waiting there. They all applauded as she entered. Clara looked around, confused and moved, not understanding what was going on. Thomas stepped up, took a microphone, and said loudly, "Today, we are here to express our gratitude and respect to someone who helped us see our true worth. Clara, you are not only a valued customer, but also someone who has made our restaurant a better place." Clara listened in silence, feeling a strange sense of dread. She had never imagined that her small actions could make such a big difference. Thomas continued, "As you know, James is one of our most important investors, and we are incredibly grateful for his support. But today, we don't just want to talk about James. We want to talk about you, who taught us that no one deserves to be discriminated against, and that respect and compassion must always be the foundation of everything we do." Thomas gestured, and Richard stepped forward, carrying a framed glass covered in red velvet. As Richard pulled the cloth away, Clara saw a large photograph of herself, taken at the restaurant table. Beneath the photograph were the words, "Clara Simmons, a changemaker." A symbol of respect and equality. Clara looked at the photo, her eyes shining with emotion. "I don't know what to say," she said, her voice choking. "I just did what I thought was right." Thomas stepped closer, smiling. Sometimes, seemingly small actions can make a big impact. "And you did, Clara." Jenna, who had refused to serve Clara that day, stepped forward. She bowed to Clara, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mrs. Clara, I want to apologize once again. My ignorance and prejudice have hurt you, and I truly regret it. Thanks to you, I have learned an important lesson about respect and fairness." Clara looked at Jenna, took her hand, and smiled gently. "You realize that, and that's what matters. We can all change if we want to." After the ceremony, Clara was invited to stay for dinner with Thomas, Richard, and several other staff members. During the meal, everyone shared their stories and thanked Clara for making them reconsider the value of human beings. The atmosphere was filled with warmth and gratitude. As Clara left the restaurant, she felt a sense of relief. The initial hurt seemed to have melted away, replaced by a belief that patience and courage could change a system. Clara stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the gentle streetlights illuminating the path ahead. A small smile spread across her lips as she thought that sometimes, change doesn't come from big things, but from the strength of a heart that refuses to budge in the face of injustice. Clara's life may not have been perfect, but she knew she had left a lasting impression, not just on that restaurant, but on everyone she met. And that was enough to make her proud. Since the restaurant's recognition ceremony, Clara feels like she has closed a memorable chapter in her life. Every time she returns to the restaurant, she is not only greeted with respect but also feels a friendly atmosphere. She realizes that the change is not only in the way people treat her, but also in the way they treat all customers, regardless of status or skin color. Jenna, the waitress who once turned Clara down, has become a model employee. Clara often sees her attentive to customers, willing to help, and not afraid to admit when she makes a mistake. One time, Jenna came to Clara's table while she was eating, bringing her a special dessert. "I want to thank her for teaching me the most important lesson of my career: never judge a book by its cover," she said, her eyes shining with sincerity. Clara nodded and smiled, sensing the maturity in Jenna's words. "Everyone has the opportunity to change, Jenna," she replied. "The important thing is that we take that opportunity and become better versions of ourselves." Not long after, Clara received a letter from the restaurant. The letter was a formal thank you from the management and staff, in which they said that the equality and respect training she had requested was now a mandatory part of the employee training process. The restaurant even instituted a new policy: any form of discrimination would be dealt with severely, with zero tolerance. One day, Clara's nephew, James, came to visit her. He brought a magazine with him, which featured an article about Clara and the restaurant. The title of the article read, "A Woman Who Inspired Change, A Story of Courage and Perseverance." In the article, James detailed how Clara faced injustice and pushed for change, turning the restaurant into a symbol of equality. Clara read the article, feeling a sense of pride. But she also knew that this story was not just about her. It was the story of all people who stood up to injustice, no matter where they were or what they did. Clara put down the magazine, looked at James, and said, "You know, change doesn't come from one person. It takes a community effort. And I'm proud to have played a small part in that." James smiled, taking her hand. "You didn't just contribute, you led the way, Grandma. From you, I learned that we should never be silent in the face of injustice." Clara knew her journey wasn't over. While she had sparked change at her restaurant, she believed there were still places in the world that needed the fight and voice of people like her. From that day on, Clara decided to get involved in community organizations to inspire and help the underprivileged. With every step, Clara became not only a strong woman who stood up to injustice, but also a living symbol of courage and determination. She understood that change can come from anyone, anywhere, if we just dare to speak up. Clara closed her magazine and took a deep breath. Looking out the window, she saw the bright sunlight illuminating the neighborhood, a reminder that every new day brought an opportunity to do the right thing. She smiled, knowing that her journey had left a mark not only on her, but on those around her. And for Clara, that was enough to fill her heart with happiness.